Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast is your one-stop shop for fantasy football news and advice. Can't decide on who to draft on the first round? Going gaga on how to line up your team. We've got you covered. Traditional league, dynasty league, PPR league, IDP league, even daily fantasy football league. Join us as we break down all the questions of fantasy football. It's the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast.
Hey there, everybody, and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Marcus Vargas, and guys, today I just want to start off, saying I hope you all are safe, I hope you all are healthy, and of course, I hope you all are practicing social distancing and staying home when necessary. Today's show is mostly going to be about fantasy football. We're going to do something similar to the mock draft, but a little bit different. We're going to be talking about a lot of potential breakout candidates for the 2020 fantasy football season. Now, of course, that is as long as there is a 2020 football season, excuse me, with all the wild things that are going on with the coronavirus and COVID-19 pandemic. One of the unfortunate realities is that sports have to be canceled and they have to be stripped away from us. And I think, that's one of the things that makes this whole situation even worse than it already is because, when terrible things happen, the world sometimes rallies behind sports. When hurricanes happen, like in Houston recently and Hurricane Katrina, football was a huge way for people to escape. Sports in general, it's an escape for people. It's hope for others. It's dreams for others. Kids that are playing sports and want to become professional athletes and do that for the rest of their lives. They can't play sports right now. And it's very, very unfortunate. It's necessary. However, I will say that even though it does really suck, it's something that has to happen to, as everyone said, flatten the curve and slow this whole thing down. So while it does suck, and I wish, the world could rally around sports and have at least that one bright spot throughout this whole thing, it is what it is. And then we have to continue as we have united, doing the right thing and being responsible. Well, I know that was on a heavier note, guys, but with that, let's get into the show and start off with some fantasy football quarterbacks that I have as potential breakout candidates for the 2020 football season. Now, to start the list off, guys, you're going to see this guy on a ton of these lists. I'm pretty sure he'll be on every single one because I think, it's pretty much consensus that he's probably going to have a big breakout year next year. And he kind of already had on his rookie year. Kyler Murray, quarterback for the Arizona Cardinals. Now, last season, Kyler Murray finished in the top 10 of fantasy football quarterbacks. That was as a rookie. You can only hope for him to get better. He has the potential to maybe even be a top 5 kind of guy. Last year he had 3,722 passing yards, 544 rushing yards, 24 total touchdowns, 12 picks, and 19.3 fantasy points per game. And I will say, guys, Kyler Murray was on my fantasy football team last year. He was my backup. I had Deshaun Watson as my starter, and I had Kyler Murray stashed on the bench because I had a feeling, I was like, this kid could be pretty darn good. And I knew he was mobile. And, in fantasy football, you guys know that that's money in the bank. So a lot of times, a quarterback doesn't have to be the best thrower or even the most accurate. He can turn the ball over. If he's rushing touchdowns, that's 6 points instead of 4. That's very good. Not to mention, Kyler Murray scored at least 20 fantasy points in 7 of his games last year. So almost half the season he was scoring 20 or more fantasy points. That most likely is going to improve next year. because I don't know if, I have to remind everyone, the Arizona Cardinals now have DeAndre Hopkins, arguably the best wide receiver in football. A lot of people, Michael Thomas, Julio Jones, DeAndre Hopkins, some people argue Devontae Adams also in that conversation. He's underrated. This is a top 3 wide receiver, added to his arsenal. And last year, he was the top 10 fantasy football quarterback with Larry Fitzgerald and Christian Kirk. So adding DeAndre Hopkins to that mix, I think Christian Kirk's only going to get better. Larry Fitzgerald's going to be, I figure, the same as he was last season, which was very good for his age and how long he's been in the league. And, this whole situation is only going to get better. Mind you, so he had 3,700 pass yards, a little bit above. Passing the 4,000 mark is going to be very easy with DeAndre Hopkins in his arsenal. Also, the 20 passing touchdowns is definitely going to see an increase. Might even get somewhere more into the 30 range, high 20s, low 30s. I could definitely see that happening. And, to wrap this all, to put the cherry on top of this whole thing, he's going to keep running with the ball. He's quick. Even though he's small and he's not Lamar Jackson, Kyler Murray is very, very fast and has good straight line speed. So look for him to definitely break out. If guys like Lamar Jackson, Pat Mahomes, all those elite guys, Deshaun Watson, if they're off the board, look for Kyler Murray. I would look for Kyler Murray, over someone who finished really well last year like Dak Prescott. I maybe even would take him over Russell Wilson. Who knows? Right now at this point in time, I think that Kyler Murray has better weapons on offense than Russell Wilson does. So it's very, very interesting. So keep him on your radar, guys. I really think that he'll have an even better season than he had last year. Now, my second guy, also a quarterback, because we're doing quarterbacks right now, is Josh Allen of the Buffalo Bills. Now, look, I know that Josh Allen really is not the most accurate guy, and he's not a big thrower. He has a huge arm, don't get me wrong. He's not wowing anybody with his passing yards. 3,089 yards, that's it. Not anything to write home about. However, he averaged 21.2 fantasy points per game. That's pretty good if you ask me. Again, he's sort of like Kyler Murray in the way that he gets a ton of fantasy points running the ball as well. He had 29 total touchdowns last season and 9 picks, which is less than Kyler Murray, to be honest, and to be fair. But he has the ability to improve. He's really in a similar situation as Kyler Murray. He just got an upgrade at the wide receiver position. He did this with only John Brown and Cole Beasley, basically. So adding Stephon Diggs to that mix is only going to make Josh Allen better. And I've talked about the Stephon Diggs edition in another episode, and I said, it's not really about Stephon Diggs here. It's about what Stephon Diggs brings to Josh Allen in terms of fantasy football. So I think, Josh Allen definitely could finish as a top 10 guy, or maybe, let's say, top 12 kind of quarterback, especially if he keeps running the ball and he gets his accuracy better, especially, he's throwing to a guy like Stephon Diggs, who's a great route runner. He has great hands. He can definitely bump himself up into, highly drafted, kind of guy, because I know a lot of people that didn't draft or pick him up off of free agency because he's on the Buffalo Bills. A lot of times, a lot of guys suffer because they're on pretty bad teams, so a lot of people stray away from them. But I think Josh Allen has a lot of upside. 510 rush yards last season, 21 fantasy points per game. You can't really argue with that. He's already had a good sample size and shown that he can be a successful fantasy football quarterback. I think with Stephon Diggs and another year in the league, he's only going to get even better. So keep your eyes on him as well. Now, for my last fantasy football breakout candidate quarterback of 2020, it's one that maybe people don't see coming. And, you might hate me for this, but I'm going to say Daniel Jones, quarterback for the New York Giants. And the reason I say this is, I understand that Daniel Jones turns the ball over like crazy. However, I think at least in his second year, I really don't expect him to turn the ball over so darn much. I think off the top of my head, he had 11 fumbles, and it was like 12 fumbles, 12 picks, 11 fumbles, 12 picks. I really don't believe that he'll fumble 11 times yet again. And I think, if you look at him like as a part of the New York Giants as a whole, he has Saquon Barkley, Evan Ingram, Sterling Shepard, Darius Slayton started emerging as a threat, and he still has Golden Tate on the team. So he has some pretty good weapons, and if Evan Ingram can stay healthy, that's going to help a ton as well. Of course, everything. You could say every argument in football relies on the health of the player, right? But Evan Ingram has a bit of an injury history, so as long as he stays healthy, that's really going to help Daniel Jones. Not to mention the fact, Daniel Jones, I know he wasn't an amazing, consistent quarterback, but he had a few games where he scored over 30 fantasy football points. So he has a tendency to have these, seemingly random huge games. And I think with another year under his belt, he can hone in that, experience, that skill, and become a more consistent fantasy football quarterback. If he's not having these huge 30-point games, I'd take, a bunch of 20-plus, 25-plus point games instead of, 4 30-plus games. I'll take that, And he's not Josh Allen. He's not Kyler Murray, Lamar Jackson. He's not going to be running the ball a ton. However, he did have that huge game against Tampa with 2 rushing touchdowns. So, he's not, it's not like he's never going to run the ball. It's not Tom Brady. So, keep your eyes on Daniel Jones, guys. I think, with another year in the league, he's getting more comfortable. I think turnovers are going to be something they're working on a ton. The Giants have something to prove. They drafted him. They shocked the whole entire world. So they're going to be doing everything they can to make sure Daniel Jones succeeds. They don't want this to look like a huge disaster and a huge flop drafting that guy. So keep your eyes on him. I'm not saying you should draft him over any of the guys I mentioned already. But, if you draft him and you stash him, that could turn out really, really well for you. I don't know a lot of people who are saying they're going to be drafting Daniel Jones as their QB1. So, definitely a good sleeper breakout candidate. Keep your eyes on him, guys. I think he could be a really interesting pickup and a really interesting stash. And, hey, if you even only play him on your bye week and he has a 30-plus point game, can you complain? So, with that, guys, we're going to go into our break. And right after, we're going to keep going with this, potential breakout talk. And we're going to move on from quarterbacks, and we're going to start talking about wide receivers. So stay tuned, guys, and we'll be right back after this short break.
Are you looking for the very best NFL and college football podcast? Then check out the GSMC Football Podcast. Get the latest football news both on and off the field. From the NFL Draft to trades to the rumor mill to the NFL Combines. They got you covered. That's GSMCpodcast.com/football-podcast. Get updates on college rivalries, game day insights, and much, much more. It's football talk the way you want it. This show eats, sleeps, and breathes football. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, guys, welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast. We're going to keep this thing going. We just got done talking about potential 2020 breakout candidates for fantasy football at the quarterback position, and now I want to move on to the wide receiver positions. I got a few guys here, so if we need to spill this into the third portion of our show, then so be it. But let's get right into it, guys. The first candidate I have for a 2020 breakout season is a receiver for the Washington Redskins, Terry McLaurin, otherwise known as Scary Terry, otherwise also known as Terry F1 McLaurin. Now, according to Pro Football Focus, Terry McLaurin was, quote, not only our highest graded rookie wide receiver this season, but joining an illustrious cast of names, he was our second highest graded rookie wide receiver in the past decade. That's pretty darn special. Guys, on this list that Terry McLaurin is on right now, he's only below Odell Beckham Jr. The other ones are Michael Thomas, Mike Evans, Antonio Brown, Keenan Allen, Demaryius Thomas, A.J. Brown, another potential breakout candidate, Tyreek Hill, Doug Baldwin, and Chris Godwin. I mean, that's a pretty wild list to be on, and all of those guys have found success in the NFL. This is very, very attractive for Terry McLaurin. Of course, he was on the Washington Redskins. He didn't have the best finish for fantasy football. He also missed a couple games during the season. Now, the first 5 games of the season, Terry McLaurin was looking like a legit wide receiver 1. He had 23 points, 17, 19. He had above 15 points 4 out of the first 5 games. That's pretty good on a team with Case Keenum. And then, of course, his quarterback switched to Dwayne Haskins, and we all saw that Dwayne Haskins wasn't very good. However, Terry McLaurin is, he's a special talent. And at this point, it seems like, if you're drafting him, you're drafting based on his talent and not his quarterback or the opportunities that he has. However, last season, McLaurin accounted for 32.7% of Washington's total passing yards. That's pretty insane. So he's going to get a ton of targets. He's going to get a ton of volume. And, we all know now that Terry McLaurin is a legit threat. He's their number 1 wide receiver. And, we can only hope for more production from him. I believe, he can be a top 20 guy easily and possibly crack the top 15. So keep an eye on Terry McLaurin. I think he for sure is going to have a breakout season next year. He's a legit receiver. He's great. And like I said, he's on a very prestigious list if you ask me. Now, the next guy I have on this list was, I previously mentioned him, obviously. Potential breakout candidate number 2 at the wide receiver position, A.J. Brown of the Tennessee Titans. Now, according to Pro Football Focus, guys, let me read this bit for you guys. Quote, among all 79 wide receivers to see 50 or more targets, Brown ranked 3rd in yards per route run, 2nd in passer rating when targeted, 2nd in missed tackles forced per reception, 1st in yards per target, 1st in yards after the catch per reception, and 1st in yards after contact per reception, end quote. That's pretty amazing, to be honest. A.J. Brown stands out in basically every metric that Pro Football Focus has for wide receivers. He's pretty darn special, and guys, it's clear that he's going to emerge as, if not already, the number 1 guy in Tennessee. Now, of course, in that offense, they're running the ball a ton, so, there is that sort of that detriment to possible fantasy football points, but with a guy like A.J. Brown, with that, it's sort of similar to Terry McLaurin. With that kind of talent, you can't doubt him. Last season, he had over 1,000 yards, he had 8 touchdowns, and you can only expect that number to increase. He is, I think he should easily rank, top 20, just like Terry McLaurin. I think he'll be a top 15 guy. Last season he finished in the 20s, but, we have to remember he was a rookie, and, his quarterback for the first bit of the season was Marcus Mariota, and then they switched to Ryan Tannehill, who was great, but they were very, very run heavy. So I think, next season, I don't think the Titans are just going to be running it down everyone's throats every single game, because that seems unsustainable. So look for A.J. Brown to emerge as the top receiver threat. He's only going to get better. He's a great wide receiver as it is. And, what can I say? The guy has amazing potential. That's my second breakout candidate for the 2020 fantasy football season at the wide receiver position. Now, the third guy I have here, another second-year guy. I know it seems like I'm doing a lot of second-year guys here, but DK Metcalf of the Seattle Seahawks. Now, guys, DK Metcalf had one of the craziest combines we've seen, and he's like a freak of nature. He slipped to round 3 or 4, I believe, because, there was a lot of questions about whether he was going to be, a complete wide receiver, or, a lot of people would just argue that he could only run streaks, and he was just really, really fast. That always, doesn't necessarily translate, John Ross, anyone? But he's improving a ton. Actually, according to Pro Football Focus, in his final 2 seasons at Ole Miss, Metcalf totaled 71% of his yards on only 2 routes, the go route and the hitch. In 2019, for the Seattle Seahawks, those 2 routes only comprised 38% of his 900 yards as a rookie. So he's already proven in 1 year in the NFL, he can completely switch his game up, become a more complete wide receiver, and, have a much bigger route tree. So, I think this first season where, he didn't have a crazy finish in fantasy football. I think he was in maybe the top 30, 35. I think he finished 33 overall, according to NFL fantasy football. That's not jumping off the page. However, I think he's going to emerge more and more like a wide receiver one. I think he can be, he's a huge guy. He can go up and get the ball, and he can also be a down the field threat stretching the field. He's going to be, he has Russell Wilson at quarterback, guys, and, when you have a great quarterback like that, usually the receivers just, I don't know if you can say they're playing better, but they usually tend to play to the level of their quarterbacks. We saw in Philly, those Eagles wide receivers, people were saying, well, he's better than Aguilar because at least he's catching the ball. Sometimes, quarterbacks elevate their players. We've seen it with Tom Brady for how many years now. So look for DK Metcalf to get even better, guys. He has a ton of potential. Like I said, he's a freak of nature, and, you guys saw him in that playoff game against Philly. He took over the game. He dominated. I think he has the potential to do that on a regular basis as he becomes more mature, as he's more of a student of the game. And so I want you to look for DK Metcalf, guys, for a breakout season. I think he could definitely crack top 20 fantasy football wide receivers. So to move on, I think I got one more second-year guy here, guys. And this one I'm a little more, how do we say this, a little more cautious on. Marquise Brown of the Baltimore Ravens. Now, here's something very, very interesting. Of 75 qualifying wide receivers, Brown ranked first in passer rating when targeted and 11th in fantasy points per route run. I'll take that to the bank. I'll definitely take that to the bank. Now, I understand, it's going to be very hard for Lamar Jackson to repeat this historic season he just had and, that crazy touchdown ratio he had. However, we have to remember, Brown his whole season was just full of injuries. He was constantly questionable, missing games, and for a deep threat speed guy, that really, really affects his game. However, I think he has a ton of potential, and with this offseason, he's definitely going to get better. He's going to get healthier, and that's going to, turn out into fantasy football success. Now, something I want to mention, guys, during the regular season, Marquise Brown only played 58% of Baltimore snaps. In the postseason, though, when he played 85% of those snaps, in that game he had 11 targets and 126 yards. That's on 85% of the snaps. I'll take that. If he's playing 100% of the snaps next season, he's only going to be more productive. Of course, he really didn't have that stellar of a season because, the injury and what have you, and the limitations in the snap count. However, you guys all saw that game against Miami. Granted, they're a horrible defense, but those first couple games, people were all in on Hollywood Brown. And I think, if he turns out to be a guy like Deshaun Jackson, who basically everyone was comparing him to during the draft, he can be super, super efficient with the targets that he gets. He might not even need 11 targets a game or those high targets a game like those other guys, such as Michael Thomas. He can just take some deep balls to the house, sort of in that vein of Tyreek Hill, and he can break out next season. So Marquise Brown, guys, definitely keep your eye on him as a breakout candidate. And if you believe in Lamar Jackson's potential, you believe that Lamar Jackson's going to get better throwing the football, then definitely count on this guy. There's no reason not to. Okay. So now we'll move on to a third-year guy and leave the rookies behind. Calvin Ridley of the Atlanta Falcons. Now, in Ridley's rookie season when he had 10 touchdowns, I think a lot of people figured that was unsustainable because he's on a team with Julio Jones. Now, of course, he didn't, have as many touchdowns this year, but he basically had the same amount of yards, the same amount of catches on the same amount of targets as his rookie season. He only had 3 less touchdowns. He averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game, which is not anything crazy, and he didn't have a crazy finish. However, guys, Austin Hooper just got moved. We have to remember that. That's a lot of targets to be thrown around now between Julio and Calvin Ridley. In fact, I want to mention, after Mohamed Sanu got traded to New England, in Ridley's final 6 games, he averaged 17.1 points per game. Of course, this is in PPR scoring, so for all of these guys, remember, this is PPR scoring as the standard format that I'm talking about here. So just keep that in mind. So he averaged 17.1 points per game. That's pretty good if you ask me. And I think without Austin Hooper, without Mohamed Sanu there, next year he's clear cut the wide receiver 2 opposite Julio Jones, who demands a ton of double teams. Calvin Ridley can really flourish here, and I think he has a lot of potential in that super pass heavy, prolific offense. He can be a top 15 guy easily. So keep top 20, top 15 easily. Keep your eye on Calvin Ridley, guys. If he's still on the board in the later rounds, definitely pick him up. Don't wait on him to be, the next guy up right there on the suggested draft thingy, because people, later in the rounds, people tend to just draft whoever the top scorer is there. However, don't wait until Calvin Ridley is the next suggested, player, or else he's going to get scooped up either by, someone who's not even at the draft, AFK drafting, or someone who, doesn't really know or care what they're doing. They're just going to pick him up because he's the highest projected scorer there. I think he has a lot of upside. I think he has a lot of potential with Matt Ryan at quarterback and the Atlanta Falcons offense to have a big year next season. So look for him to have, I think, over 1,000 yards next year, 7 to 9 touchdowns. He's going to be a solid fantasy football wide receiver, guys. So with that, we'll take a break here, and after the break, we'll move into the running backs. So stay tuned, guys, and we'll be right back.
Check out the show that's built on the MMA. From the UFC to extreme cage fighting, they got the fights covered. Check out the GSMC MMA podcast. Get the latest news on past or upcoming fights. Join us as we talk to and about some of the biggest names in the MMA, past, present, and future. When it's the fight game, there's just one show to check out. GSMCpodcast.com/MMA-podcast. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit GSMCpodcast.com for more info.
Alrighty, guys, welcome back to the Fantasy Football Breakout Candidate Show. That's basically what it is today. We just got done talking about, the wide receiver candidates for a breakout season in 2020, and now I'm going to move on to running backs. And to start this list off, I want to start with a team that actually had a ton of trouble with their wide receivers. The Philadelphia Eagles. I believe that Miles Sanders is primed for a breakout season in 2020. And I think a lot of people agree with me here. I've mentioned this previously. After Jordan Howard sat out a ton of games, Miles Sanders averaged 20.4 PPR points per game. That's special. Honestly, guys, that's elite fantasy football running back. And, that's a top RB1 kind of deal there. Miles Sanders now is in his second year. I talked about a lot of rookies today because, after your rookie season, of course some guys go into a sophomore slump, but you learn more, you become a better player, and you have the potential to break out. I know for receivers it's maybe later, like third year, but anyway, that's besides the point. Miles Sanders is now the top guy in Philly after Jordan Howard left to the Dolphins, and I'm hoping that they don't draft a running back or really, add to the running back room in free agency because they don't need to. Boston Scott and Miles Sanders are just fine, and I'm sure that Miles Sanders can do all the heavy lifting, and I think he can be their top guy. They haven't had, a number one top guy in quite some time. Of course, that's worked for them. We saw what happened when they were using Jay Ajayi and LeGarrette Blount. They went to a Super Bowl and had a very good 1-2 punch there. However, for fantasy football, we don't like that. We don't like 1-2 punches unless it's going to be hyper efficient like Mark Ingram and Alvin Kamara were in New Orleans. And, it's just tough because even then, on a game-to-game basis, you don't know who to bet on. You don't know who's going to be getting all the touchdowns, who's going to be getting all the yards. So it makes it much, much easier for fantasy owners to deal with just one running back and no committees. So, like I said, the average 20 points per game he had in those last games without Jordan Howard is very good, and I feel like he can keep that up. He's in an offense where, he's the pass catching back as well, and if he can just take all the, the workhorse duties, he's going to be averaging a ton of points per game, mostly in PPR. For standard scoring, it's going to be a bit different, guys. He's going to do a lot of pass catching, so he's going to get a ton of points for receptions, but if you're in standard leagues, of course, this is going to be a little bit different. I remind you all again that I based all of these off of PPR scoring systems. I think we might see a shift in the running back room in Philly because, of course, like I've said, Doug Peterson he's tended to go for running back duos, and I think Miles Sanders is like the one true one that has the potential to be the number one guy. And they drafted him. He wasn't traded for or a free agent or anything like that like those other guys. They drafted him. They believed in him. So hopefully they continue that belief. And if they do, guys, Miles Sanders has RB1 potential. So don't sleep on him in the draft. If he's available to you in the later mid rounds, I don't see him going past round 3. To be honest, I think, you should be drafting him round 3 and below. If he's still on the board, definitely draft him. Like I say all the time, sometimes even just being a starter on a team is worth, being picked up in fantasy football. And especially at the RB position. So keep your eyes on Miles Sanders, guys. One of my top breakout candidates at the running back position for fantasy football. Now my next guy is a guy I've talked about a bunch already, and so I'll try and keep this a little bit shorter. Kenyon Drake of the Arizona Cardinals. Now, guys, last season, he had 817 yards on 50 receptions. 817 rush yards with 50 receptions and 345 receiving yards. To add on to that, he had 8 total touchdowns. And that was after being part of the Miami Dolphins and not really doing much there, and then being traded at the trade deadline. Now that David Johnson's gone, he's the top guy, and in his 8 games with the Arizona Cardinals, he averaged 19.1 PPR points per game. So that's, again, top running back potential. It's very clear that he can handle the duties. David Johnson's now gone. He has no competition in the running back room. Kyler Murray is only going to get better. The offense is only going to get better. Cliff Kingsbury is in his second year as a coach. He's getting used to the NFL. He's, going to evolve his offenses. They're pass heavy to the running back. It's kind of like PPR heaven right now in Arizona. So, look for Kenyon Drake to be an RB1, guys. He should definitely be drafted he's going to be a top 2 running back drafted selection in the fantasy football drafts. He should be. Nobody should be letting this guy slip. I think he's going to have a great season. And why I call, he was a great running back last season, but why I'm calling this a breakout is because he didn't get a full season with Arizona. Now we get to see him as a starter, as the main option for the Cardinals, and I think that in that role, he's going to flourish and have a great year. So guys, keep your eyes on Kenyon Drake for sure. I've said this already. He's not a young guy. He's been in the league for quite some time. I think he's 27, 26 now. So, it's not like he's a rookie having this breakout season, but I think he's had it in this whole time, and now he has a chance to show as a number 1 guy that he can carry fantasy football managers to some great, great wins. Now, I'll move on to another second-year guy whose season unfortunately got cut a bit short. Josh Jacobs of the Las Vegas Raiders, guys. A lot of people figured that Josh Jacobs was going to be the rookie of the year. Of course, Kyler Murray ended up winning that, and deservingly so. He definitely deserved it. But Josh Jacobs was outstanding as a rookie for Las Vegas. He had 1,150 rush yards, and while he's not featured much in the pass game, so, it's tough for PPR, he has a lot of potential, and I think next season, he might get more involved in the pass game in Las Vegas. He only had 20 catches. That sucks. And he missed some games because he had a shoulder injury. But if he ups, let's say he gets 40 catches. Let's say he doubles the catch total. Hopefully, John Gruden sees that potential. This rookie, he's a great running back. I'll take that. He missed, I think it was 3 games off the top of my head, and he still had a top 25 fantasy football finish. So for sure, he should be a top 25 pick. And I'm not saying top 25 running back pick. I think, top 30 pick overall in the draft. That's definitely justifiable for a top guy running back. I expect the Las Vegas Raiders to run that offense around him because right now he's the best player on that offense. If you can finish as a top 25 guy and miss 3 games, that's pretty darn good, especially doing that as a rookie on a team that's not known for being very successful or very prolific on offense. Now, of course, he's going to be higher value in non-PPR leagues. Of course, I'm basing this off PPR, so I think he'll be I think he could be a low-end RB1 in PPR. I think at lowest he'll be, high-end RB2. But he has a lot of potential, and I think he'll break out next season. He'll have an even bigger year than he had last year. So keep your eyes on Josh Jacobs, guys. Don't just forget about him because he's on the Raiders. Now, for my last breakout candidate, he's not really a sleeper. He's definitely well-known around the league, especially now because he played in the Super Bowl, guys. Raheem Mostert of the San Francisco 49ers. Now, I've been in on this guy for the past 2 years now. I had him on my fantasy football team 2 years ago, right before he broke his arm, unfortunately, and missed a ton of the season. But I think that Raheem Mostert has been the best back in San Francisco. For some reason, Kyle Shanahan, it's hard to predict who he's going to use on a day-to-day basis in the backfield. But Raheem Mostert averaged over 5 yards per carry in the regular season, and only on 137 touches, he had 10 total touchdowns, 772 yards. That's pretty bonkers, guys. And I think if he's the number one guy in San Francisco, he can do a lot of damage. We saw what he did in the NFC Championship game, and I understand that that's completely unsustainable. But if we look at his last 6 games of the regular season, 23 points, 20 points, 24, 10, 11, and 20. So he can take over a backfield, average a ton of points, and he's a great pass catching kind of guy too. He has insane speed, and I think he's done his job and shown, he can take over as a lead back. He did it when it mattered most, and Kyle Shanahan should see that and not force so much competition in this running back room. However, guys, the reason I have him as more of a sleeper and keep your eye on him, maybe not draft him as high as these other guys, is because that running back room is so crowded with Tevin Coleman, Matt Breida, Raheem Mostert himself, and Jerick McKinnon. I know a lot of people have forgot about Jerick McKinnon, but he was a solid back before being injured, a few years ago and last year as well. So it's tough. It's hard to say what they're going to do there, but keep your eye on Raheem Mostert. If he's the top guy in San Francisco, he's going to have a big season. So with that, guys, let's get into our break, and right after that, we'll come back. We'll talk tight ends. We'll even maybe talk defenses. So stay tuned, guys, and we'll be right back.
Check out the show built around the women of MMA. From the UFC to the extreme cage fighting, we got the fights covered.
Listen.
It's the Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast. The latest news of upcoming fights, discussions of previous matches. Join us as we talk to and about the biggest names in women's mixed martial arts, past, present, and future. When it's the women's fight game, you know where to listen to. The Golden State Media Concepts Women's MMA Podcast.
We keep the train rolling. We just got done talking about some fantasy football breakout candidates for the 2020 season at the running back position, and now we move on to tight ends. Now, of course, guys, as I always say, this is a super scarce position in fantasy football. There's basically a top 5, and the rest are basically exactly the same. Excuse me. But I want to talk about a few guys here who I think are in line for a big fantasy football season. Some of these guys, I believe, could definitely be in the top 10 and maybe, one or two can crack the top 5. So let's look at my fantasy football breakout candidates for the 2020 season at the tight end position. First and foremost, I have to start off with O.J. Howard, Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Now, of course, O.J. Howard had a very disappointing season last year. I mean, he was basically a breakout candidate last year before the season started because he had, a stellar season the year prior, but it got limited by his injury. Now, he's a young guy. A lot of people looked at him like a stud, and he had 5 touchdowns, 565 receiving yards, and only 10 games in Tampa Bay before Bruce Arians became the head coach. However, as soon as Bruce Arians came in, O.J. Howard basically became a bench player. He definitely disappeared from the offense. He wasn't a big factor, didn't get, huge amount of targets or receptions, and his fantasy value was basically nothing. He was the same as some tight end 2 on a different team. Now, though, with Tom Brady, we know how much Tom Brady likes a good tight end. O.J. Howard is definitely a talented guy, and I think he figures to become a big part of this Tampa Bay offense next season. Now, of course, the Tampa Bay offense is going to revolve around Chris Godwin, Mike Evans, and I know that Tampa Bay also has Cameron Brate at tight end, but I honestly believe that, O.J. Howard is the better of the two. Now, I understand, the concern with Cameron Brate, but I know O.J. Howard had a horrible season last year, but he still had more receiving yards than Cameron Brate. So we do have to take that into account. Now, of course, this is, it hangs upon a lot of things, because there's so many skilled players on this team. There's a lot of, targets to be thrown around. But I believe O.J. Howard is a very talented guy, and if he can, play again to that top potential that he had just a few years ago, he's going to be a top weapon in the red zone for Tom Brady, and he's going to get a lot of fantasy points because he's going to be catching a ton of touchdowns from Tom Brady. It's quasi Rob Gronkowski role for Tom Brady here in Florida. So keep an eye on O.J. Howard. Of course, we have to wait and see. He's definitely a guy. I don't think, you're drafting him like this is for sure. This guy's going to have a breakout year because, of course, there is that competition with Cameron Brate. However, should he take that spot from Cameron Brate? I think he's a guy worth stashing because if he takes that spot from Cameron Brate and he's catching all the touchdowns in the red zone, it's instant fantasy success at the tight end position and a guy you want to keep your eyes on. So keep an eye on O.J. Howard, guys, I'll say it's more of a bounce back. I know I'm kind of cheating here. It's kind of a bounce back season rather than a breakout, but we'll count it as a breakout season because he has a new quarterback. It's a new era sort of in Tampa Bay, so we'll leave it like that. Now, the next guy I have as a candidate for a breakout season at the tight end position, Noah Fant of the Denver Broncos. Now, like I said, the tight end list is very, very short, so you're probably going to see Noah Fant all over the internet on potential breakout candidates for tight ends. I think he's probably going to be, the top choice because, he was a rookie last year. And, it's important to note, guys, tight ends, they tend, George Kittle, Mark Andrews, Dallas Goedert, those were guys who were much more productive in their second year rather than their first year. So, tight ends have this tendency to, make that big leap in the second year, especially recently. So that's why Noah Fant has a lot of potential here. Now, of course, he was very inconsistent. However, he had horrible quarterbacks. Let's be honest here. Joe Flacco was nothing special. Drew Lock has some, potential, but, before him, he had Brandon Allen, I believe his name was, a guy that not really many people know and a guy who wasn't very good as well. Of course, Drew Lock has some potential, and now that he's, the starter there, hopefully they can build a rapport. But Noah Fant, I think he's the guy, he's one of the top guys at tight end because, he's the number one on the team. There's not really competition there. So he's a top candidate primed for a breakout year. I don't think he's going to be, he's not breaking the top 5. Definitely not going to be one of those guys next year, possibly later down the road, but I think he has the potential to break the top 10 tight ends, I think, for sure, because, not that there's much competition in fantasy football at the tight end position anyway, but being the top guy, having a lot of big playability, a lot of potential, and just seeing how tight ends usually tend to go, Noah Fant's an interesting selection for breakout candidate for 2020. So keep your eyes on him if you find yourself in a hole and there's not other tight ends left. Now, my last selection for a breakout season at the tight end position, I think I'll have to go with Jonnu Smith of the Tennessee Titans. Now, the reason I'm doing this, I really like Dallas Goedert, right? I wanted to select Dallas Goedert for this last spot here, but Zach Ertz is just so much of a security blanket for Carson Wentz. He's still a great player, and he's still on the Eagles. So that's why, it's very hard to choose Dallas Goedert as a breakout candidate. But Jonnu Smith is basically taking over as the number one tight end in Tennessee because Delanie Walker, he's on his way to retirement. He's been injured the past 2 years so much. So, if we look at his numbers, last year he had a career high in receptions, yards, targets, and he had 41% of the tight end target share of the team. So that's pretty good. And after establishing himself as that number one with the ability to be, the top tight end, it only makes sense that he's going to get more targets, more production. And if we look at his numbers from last year, guys, he had 12.5 yards per reception. That's pretty good. Top tight ends get that kind of yards per reception. Also, he had 8.4 yards after the catch per reception, 79.5% catch rate. That's according to Next Gen Stats. Those are good for fourth and third among receivers, respectively. So, guys, Jonnu Smith has a lot of potential, and I think, with another year on the Tennessee Titans, with Ryan Tannehill there being more familiar with the offense, not switching from quarterbacks, they're coming off a wild season that saw them get really, really hot towards the end and take out some of the biggest teams in football. So keep your eyes on Jonnu Smith, guys, definitely for a top 10 fantasy football finish at the tight end position. I think he's going to break out next season, and I think he's going to shock a lot of people. So with that, guys, we're going to go into our break, and when we get back, I want to talk some fantasy football defenses. They don't get a lot of love here, so I want to, talk about the ones that are interesting me, and ones that, may, let's say, quote unquote, break out. So stay tuned, guys. We'll be right back after the break.
Are you looking to get your college football fix? Looking to get the latest news on your favorite school's team? The GSMC College Football Podcast is your ticket to all things college football. Join us as we talk college football from the national championship, the college rivalries, the bowl game, to the Heisman Trophy. To which conference is the best? We've got you covered for the Big Ten, SEC, Big 12, the Pac-12, ACC, and everything in between. Download the GSMC College Football Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Alrighty, everybody, welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Now, guys, we just got done talking about pretty much every skill position for the candidates for 2020 breakout seasons, and now I want to move on and talk about some defenses and special teams. Now, while they're not all necessarily, breakout candidates and what have you, I just want to talk about, these fantasy defenses because fantasy defenses, like kickers, really don't get that much love, and a lot of people don't really talk about them. It's one of those things where, a lot of people, they wait till their last few rounds and they draft a defense if it's not one of the, top 3, top 5 defenses, kind of like kicker. I know a lot of people who don't even draft kickers. They just sign one off of free agency when the draft is over. Now, I want to talk about the defenses because I think there's going to be a shakeup. New England had a historic season as a fantasy football defense. They had a historic season as a defense in general. Now, mind you, the New England Patriots had a very, very easy schedule. They have an easy schedule pretty much every year because they get, 6 games against the Bills, the Jets, and the Dolphins. Nobody's writing home about those teams. But last year was pretty absurd. They basically were like a skill position player, and as a defense, they scored more than several skill positions players on the season. For their total points, guys, the New England Patriots defense scored 225 points. Guys, that's better than a lot of wide receivers, running backs, tight ends for sure. And, they won a lot of people their leagues. Just to put in perspective, the number 2 defense, the Steelers, had 181. That's with the standard rules, nothing crazy, no crazy bonuses, just the regular, you get, you lose points per, 100 yards, you lose points for the scores, things like that. You get the touchdowns for punt returns, kick returns, etc. So the Patriots defense is not going to repeat that way. And I want to caution a lot of people from drafting them again. I really think that they're going to have a huge drop off, with Tom Brady gone. Not that the offense was anything special last season. I believe that the offense is going to get much, much worse. Julian Edelman is only getting older, and he was their best wide receiver last season, even though he did have a ton of drops. However, you're taking the GOAT out of that system, and I think, with the offense sputtering even more, that defense is going to be on the field a lot more, and they're not going to be nearly as good. Never mind the fact that, the Bills are getting much better. The Jets, so-so, but the Dolphins, I got some faith in them, and I mean, hey, we saw what they did to the Patriots in Week 17, so don't sleep on them either. Now, one thing too is the Patriots have lost key contributors on defense. One most importantly being Kyle Van Noy, and some other linebackers. Jamie Collins got moved, I believe, as well. It's not the same exact defense coming back. Of course, they kept the McCourty twins, solid players. Stephon Gilmore still there, arguably the best corner in the league. That's fine, but the whole unit is not the same as it was last year, and I believe that they're actually going to finish outside of the top 5, possibly outside of the top 10. So they're a big faller for me. I really don't think they're going to finish anywhere near the top of fantasy football defenses next year. Now, I want to talk about sort of I guess you can say it's a breakout, but not really, because they're always pretty good. I believe that the top defense next year, actually, guys, could be the Baltimore Ravens. And I say this because they got so close to a Super Bowl. Lamar Jackson wins the MVP. Not that they made it to the championship game, but everyone thought that they were the best team in football. Everyone thought that they were for sure going to the Super Bowl, and Lamar Jackson would have an MVP and a Super Bowl MVP and, storybook kind of stuff. That defense with Marcus Peters and Marlon Humphrey might have the best cornerback duo in the league. Never mind the fact that they're shoring up the defensive line with huge run stuffers, which was, we saw was their biggest weakness in the playoffs. And they kept Matthew Judon. They didn't they learned from last year, and they're only going to get better. The Ravens, they're aggressive. They blitz a lot. They're of course their pass rush has to get better, but, they finished as fantasy's 4th defense last year with what they had and with their bad pass rush. So think about that, they can only get better, I believe. With the additions that they got, they kept a lot of the same guys. So, look for the Ravens to have a surge next year. Again, they're playing teams like the Bengals, the Browns, the Steelers. I'm not sure are going to sort of rise and be, what they used to be back in, the Triple B days. Ben Roethlisberger coming off a big injury on his arm, and, who knows with the age and time and the time off, how he's going to perform. So I want to keep an eye on them as a top finisher. Now, I want to talk about some defenses that might surprise us next season. And, I want to mention the Chiefs, because I know that, a lot of people are just going to, it's my bias. So whatever, what have you, it's my bias. They're my favorite team. I'm just picking them because whatever. But the thing is, the Kansas City Chiefs, they finished as fantasy's number 11 defense last year. Now, I'd probably win a bet against anyone who told me that people are going to guess that they were top 11. People just write them off. They have a crappy defense, which, believe me, we have had for the past recent years. However, 2 years ago, we led the league in sacks. And this year, I think we were middle of the pack, maybe top 15, top 10 in sacks. That's usually a key on being a good fantasy football defense. Also, last year we finished with 16 interceptions and 7 fumble recoveries and 4 touchdowns. Again, you have to remember too, we have very dynamic kick and punt returners, which adds to defensive points. Again, guys, you have to remember the special teams also counts for the defense that you draft. Of course you guys knew that, but a lot of people don't think about, I'm going to draft this defense because their special teams is solid. The Chiefs defense is vastly improved from last year. I'm not saying this year from the Super Bowl winning year, but prior to the Super Bowl winning year, we've improved a ton. And, we've kept Chris Jones. We still have Frank Clark, Tyrann Mathieu still there. Juan Thornhill, who was a standout rookie, he was playing great. He got injured. He'll be coming back off of injury. He'll be healthy, ready to go. And I'm sure they'll shore up some of the cornerback issues in the draft. So keep an eye on the Kansas City Chiefs. I think their pass rush is going to be solid. The Tyrann Mathieu is only going to get better. He's a leader. Juan Thornhill is only going to get better, and I think they could surprise a lot of people and finally crack that top 10 as a fantasy football defense. I'll also remind you guys, we get to play the Chargers twice a year who don't have the best quarterback. We get to play the Broncos twice a year who don't have the best quarterback. We get to play the Raiders twice a year who, Derek Carr is solid, but he's not, anything crazy or special. So just remember, there's 6 pretty solid games in there, against, not the best quarterback. So keep the Chiefs on your radar. I'm not just saying that. Well, I am saying it because I'm a Chiefs fan, but that's not the only reason I'm bringing it up. I got the numbers and the facts to back it up, guys. Now I want to talk about one more defense that I think is probably going to break out next season. And that one is the Miami Dolphins. Now, guys, I know the Miami Dolphins were absolutely terrible last season on offense and defense. Of course, they had shining spots in Devontae Parker. Ryan Fitzmagic gave the Chiefs a gift by beating the Patriots in Week 17. But their defense was the worst defense in the league by far. Just to put it in perspective, I told you the Patriots total points at 225. The Miami Dolphins point total for last year was 22. That's pretty insane. I think just having a normal season at this point, an average season, would be a huge breakout for them and a bump. However, guys, I really like their free agent signings. I'll start with cornerback Byron Jones. Yes, he doesn't create a ton of turnovers, which is good for fantasy football. However, he's a lockdown corner. Him and Xavier Howard, arguable, they can be in that discussion for best cornerback tandem as well. I mentioned Marlon Humphrey and Marcus Peters, but Xavier Howard and Byron Jones, no slouches. They're lockdown guys, and that's a very good cornerback duo. Never mind the fact that they've signed Cal Van Noy, who graded very well according to Pro Football Focus. And, he was a part of that historic defense that I was talking about earlier. So he has experience in a great defense. He has the tie to Brian Flores with the New England Patriots. And there's another signing that they had on the defense, Shaq Lawson from the Buffalo Bills. Now, while people don't really, Shaq Lawson's not a household name, and he only had 6.5 sacks last season, that sack total would have led the Miami Dolphins. So think about that. It's an instant upgrade. Also, I like the fact that Shaq Lawson comes from the Buffalo Bills because they were a solid defense. Even just playing on a solid defense gives you the experience necessary to sort of translate that to another team. So these signings, while the offense, of course, has to perform and, keep the defense off the field all of the time, that defense is looking pretty solid. Definitely, I think going to surprise a lot of people. They're not going to finish as the worst fantasy football defense. I can tell you that right now. I'll take that to the bank. Guarantee it. They won't be 32nd, so they can be 31. So with that, guys, I'm gonna leave it there. We're gonna go into our break. When we get back, we'll talk some wishes, and then we'll wrap up the show for you guys. So stick around, guys. We'll go into a quick break and keep an eye on those Dolphins, guys. I'm telling you, they're gonna surprise a lot of people.
This is your ultimate stop for everything sports. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Should I say more? From the NFL, MLB, the NBA to MMA, it's all in here. The Golden State Media Concepts Sports Podcast. Listen now.
Alrighty, guys, we are entering the final segment of the show today, which is, of course, Marcus's 3 wishes. Guys, we had basically a jam-packed show of fantasy football perspective stuff, breakout candidates. We talked defenses, potential surprises, and, potential top leading defense in the Baltimore Ravens. And now I just want to share with you some of my wishes, as I always do at the end of the show. Now, guys, for wish number 1 today, it might take up a lot of the segment, so I might not have time for other wishes, but this is an important one. I wish for these NFL players, people, with large platforms, to do the most that they can to help this situation. Now, what I'm talking about is obviously the coronavirus situation, and recently, Dak Prescott posted a picture with Dez Bryant and a couple other people that they were working out together. Lamar Jackson did the same with AB and some others. And guys, we can talk about this from a football standpoint, but honestly, right now I'm going to ignore that because there's a bigger problem at hand. And it's the irresponsibility to be a role model and set the example for others in this time of need. It is pretty clear that working out with multiple people, and, huddling together for a group picture, in each other's arms is not practicing good social distancing, and being safe during this time where the virus can easily be spread. Now, one thing, that confused me about all of this is that, are those players also not concerned about the virus? It's very hard to track how many people each of those people have come in contact with, and, you can't always be sure. The thing is, guys, we all have to pretend as if we've been sick or we've been in contact with someone who's had the virus and act like that. Posing for a picture, working out with 6 guys, 5 guys, huddling all together is not being responsible, and it's not sending a good message. No matter what you guys think about these players, they're great players, and I'm sure that they're great people, but this was irresponsible. And especially in a time like this, I understand they want to sort of just give the people some good content, some positive content. It's given shows a ton to talk about. People talking about Dez Bryant's possible return to the Cowboys. Would he be good or not? And I'll say, I'll mention it flat out right here. Dez Bryant back to the Cowboys would be completely irrelevant for fantasy football. I don't think he would be doing much in his return. He didn't really, him and Dak Prescott didn't do well together when he was there. When he was a few years younger, he hasn't played football in 2 or 3 years. I don't think he comes back off an Achilles injury and returns to form. Dez Bryant was never a fast guy. He was never had the burners. It was just throw it up and go get it. He's only gotten slower, so it doesn't even matter for fantasy football. So like I was saying, it was disappointing to see because these are the leaders. A lot of kids look up to these guys, and a lot of people look up to these guys in general. And to see that, even though, yes, it seems like something very small, it's the principle of the whole situation. If you're going to do that and you're posting pictures about it, what do you do that you aren't posting pictures of? Where do you go, when the cameras aren't around? So that's just one thing that bothered me. So I wish for these players to take this a bit more seriously, and I'm hoping that a lot of these other players don't think they're invincible because they're celebrities and NFL football players, because should any of them catch the virus and it become a big issue in the NFL, it will jeopardize the start of the season. And, that's something that we really, really don't need right now. It's something I've already talked about. Sports are very, very important in times like this. The NFL season starting up at the right time would feel like sort of a saving grace and just a breath of fresh air. So, disappointing, but it is what it is, and we got to roll with it. So that's my wish number 1 for today. I know a little bit on the heavier, darker, more serious side, but, these things need to be addressed. And that's one thing I take pride in, being able to address things no matter what. I understand, you guys come here for fantasy football, but, there are a lot of important things that need to be discussed as well that pertain to football players. So, wish number 2. This one is way more lighthearted. And I have a feeling a lot of people share this one with me. I just wish the NFL draft was here already. Now, I know that that's sort of silly, but my goodness, I don't think I've ever been itching for a draft more than I am right now. And it's not because, oh my gosh, look at how many great players. It's going to be the best draft class ever. It's just because of the lack of sports right now. And I know that, I think there's going to be a lot of hype surrounding this draft just because it's something to watch. We might see the highest ratings on this draft ever because, a lot of people are going to tune in, because it's the first, real sports related thing we can watch that we haven't been able to in a long time. Other than that, though, I'm excited to see where teams go, with their picks. I'm excited for, the shakeups, the trades that always happen. It's something I'm dying for this year, more than ever. And of course, I hope my Chiefs draft a running back. I've mentioned that before, but I just want to see it go on no matter what. If, coronavirus gets worse and, they can't meet up together, I want to watch a virtual draft. I don't want it to be postponed or anything like that. I don't care. Go into a Zoom classroom, have the coaches draft from Zoom. That's fine with me. Have all the draft prospects stay home. Doesn't matter to me. We just need this. So my wish would be, I wish for it to hurry up and get here, but of course I wish for it to stay, not be postponed, stay where it is. Of course, the public aspect of it, that's fine being taken away. We don't need that. But to just have that come in and sort of, give us a break from all the bad stuff, would be absolutely wonderful. And of course, Chiefs drafting a running back would also be great too. But to move on to my last wish for the day, guys, I wish for Jadeveon Clowney to make it onto a team. It's definitely been disappointing for him. He has not gotten the market at all that he was expecting. He wanted $20 million a season, but recent reports have said that he's now asking for a lower price, at $17 million a season. And now there's some buzz around the Cleveland Browns potentially signing Jadeveon Clowney. So if, the Cleveland Browns end up getting Jadeveon Clowney along with Myles Garrett, Olivier Vernon, that could be pretty friggin' scary. If the Browns land Jadeveon Clowney, their defense is going to be pretty solid for fantasy football as well. A lot of the reason, they had, not the greatest fantasy football defense last season, but their secondary is pretty solid. Denzel Ward is a standout corner. He dealt with some injuries last season. Their secondary is not too bad. That Myles Garrett, Olivier Vernon, Myles Garrett, of course, was suspended for the entire season for what, but they can return to form. If they find out who they are, the offense gets back on track and they just stop being the Cleveland Browns, they can be a solid defense as well. So my last wish would be for Jadeveon Clowney to finally land on a team. I think he deserves another shot. I don't think he deserves $20 million a year. I think he was a little bit crazy for that one, but he has potential. And maybe, being on the Cleveland Browns could help them, not be the Browns anymore. So that's my final wish for the day, guys. I know I kind of rushed through the last two there because the first one was pretty long, but as always, I want to thank you guys for tuning in to the GSMC Fantasy Football Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. Guys, I want to ask that you leave a review or, just a comment. Let us know how we're doing, if we're doing bad or doing good. Everything helps, but of course, keep it respectful and constructive. Also, I want to ask that you follow us on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. That helps us a lot. And, of course, guys, I hope you stay safe. I hope you stay healthy. I hope you still have toilet paper. And I hope you're social distancing, guys. Have a good night, and we'll see you here next time.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Fantasy Football Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.